Well, hello everybody, I'm LA Little, and this is your daily NeoTA wrap. We take a look at these markets. We do it from a neoclassical perspective each time, asking ourselves what happened today? What does it tell us about the coming ones? We do this show 4 times a week, Monday through Thursday, broadcast at or before 10 o'clock Eastern Time, archived on YouTube under the channel LA Little. If you tune in on a Sunday, we also do a weekly show where we take a little bit broader look, and we'll do that a little bit tonight because actually we have an early close to the week with the holiday weekend coming up. Let me first thank all of you for joining me. As always, I ask you to tell a friend or two. It's easy to share what I do. Just go to YouTube up there, do a share, send it over to some of your friends who might get benefit from it. As far as the holiday, I also want to wish you, those of you who are domestic, a holiday greetings, and have a happy and safe 4th of July, Independence Day. Let's get started here. As far as what we did with the markets today. If you remember last night, we were saying probably the up is about done, and that's pretty much what happened today. Slightly higher on the NDX, but pretty much everywhere else slightly down. Russell still taking the brunt of it. If you look at the the ending numbers in terms of the week, it was a pretty tough week. Russell was down 2.5–3%. Everything was down 1.5% or so. So it was a rough week for the markets, and hopefully you were reasonably well prepared for that. As far as the rest of the market, very quiet day. You had nat gas up. You had the dollar down a little bit. Bonds got hit again early and then bounced back, but not a lot going on. We'll take a look at gold. We'll take a look at oil. Those were interesting today, and of course we'll take a look at the markets. So let's get started. Let's start with the S&P 500. So here's the S&P. Last night we were looking at this retest regen, right? So this is a bearish retest regen. You're coming back up, and you're trying to see if buyers are willing to buy at higher price on the way back up. So in other words, if we get this drawn in just right, which is right about there, as they come back to the top of this bar, that's where you're going to find out, as they come back to the top of that bar. And we're talking about this bar here, right? When you come back to the top of it, will buyers step up and buy? And so far, that hasn't been the case. These last 2 days, volume is shrinking. Of course, everybody's on vacation, so I don't want to read too much into it. But the other negative is you just had a big spill, right? Now you get your bounce. And what's usually next? Well, it's usually the continuation, the ABCD structure off a failure to get over this retest and instead regenerate, right? Regenerate to the downside. So that setup's still in place. Today you go over, back under after the bounce, less volume. That also suggests the same thing. You already had a conversion to, a transition to confirmed bearish because you broke 3 swing point lows. But the key thing here is that you did not break on the weekly. The weekly actually held. So you tested the weekly. You had less volume, right? Now that speaks the other way. In other words, this is saying, hey, on a longer term basis, and we're talking about the intermediate term time frame, this thing has not broken, right? It's still holding that swing point low. Test it with less volume, doesn't break it. That says, hey, that's a test. That's a good test. This thing can bounce. So on a weekly basis, the S&Ps can bounce. On a daily basis, it looks to me like they're going to go down and try to test again. Now, what could set up a better move back to the top side would be, right, a push back down off this bearish retest and regen down, and you get down to these lows and you can't break them. That would set up a nice spike back up the other way potentially. So that will be the thing to keep your eye on next week and see how that potential setup plays out. As far as the NASDAQ, You got the same situation, bearish retest regen. It's coming off this bar again, test into it a couple times, can't get over it, volume shrinking. You don't have a high volume low, but you have a higher volume low. Not much to speak of, but lower. Turned bearish, right? You get the bounce again. That says, hey, I can go lower. I can come back down, test again. In this case, it hasn't tested that swing point low yet, so this one could test into that support zone if it so chooses. So again, daily kind of bearish, weekly not. Retest regen here on the NDX, same story, same price points, everything looks the same. And if you look at it on a weekly, also did not test nor did it break swing point low. If we look at the Russell now, the Russell was the one that took the heat this week, and the end of the week the Russell actually did a nice positive turn. So if you look at this guy, he says, hey, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to test that high volume low, or actually it wasn't a high volume low, but it was a wide price spread low. Test it on lighter volume here compared to there, right? And what do? You get back over it, you close over it. That's a clean test. And the Russell has not broken on this time frame. I mean, it broke up here, but it hasn't broken, excuse me, I said that wrong. It has broken on this time frame, did not break two swing point lows. In other words, transition to sideways, not bearish, which is what everything else has. If we look at the weekly, the Russell's got a long way to go to get down there. Now the Russell was doing a bullish retest regen, and so if you push that out and you look at the Russell, it looks something like that. The low here, 1248.23. The low today, 1248.26. So what does that mean? Stayed inside of it, and this can try to regenerate back to the top side. So on the Russell, you've got a bullish setup coming in the next week. You got it bullish on the weekly in that it's retested and going to try to regen. You got it bullish on the daily because it actually went under back over. So the Russell should try to bounce higher come next week. So that's the way the index is set up. A little different setup than last night. Last night was fairly bearish right across the board. Tonight, not so. Let's go to the overseas markets. Let me hit India first. India went up to test the high today. That was 28.099, yesterday's high. Got over it, back under it, less volume. That's a failure and a failure off the swing point. So India looks like it's going to try to pull back in now. The fact that it had a nice big spike up with volume the day prior, though, says it's the pullback probably is going to be light, and then it will try again. So right now, India is setting up to do some more testing after a little bit of a pullback. Also want to look at Australia, my friends over there. And if we look at it, it's just a series of lower highs, lower lows, which is kind of the classical definition of a downtrend. As far as on the upside, what it's doing, it got over this bearish retest regen. So let's draw these in real quick. Got over this one, right? And now testing into that one. So this is the real test right now. This is saying, hey, at least on this time frame, this is probably more like this now, at least for now. And we should get some sort of a failure, probably pull back, and then we'll see if it holds and can regenerate back up the upside. So that's the way that one's set up. Let's look at it on the weekly. And the weekly actually has a test under. And it almost got into the high of the low. That would have been a cleaner test if it had, but it didn't. It did get into this big bar, which was the breakout, and 36.9, 34. So that actually is a pretty good hammer reversal. So I would think maybe a little pullback and then try to push up one more time. So that doesn't look too bad compared to what it did, 2-3 days ago. And my friends up in Canada, Toronto's exchange looks pretty much like the U.S. Fairly negative. Nothing very good about that. Now this one did test into, this one finally did the test. So this actually can get a good bounce too. So it tests into the high of the high volume low, no volume, reverses. That also can try to push back up. So that looks pretty good. Let's look at Europe because that's where everything's happening. So if we go into France, now, one thing you have to look at, and it just kind of stands out, so you kind of have to take a glance at it, is you kind of have these big islands taking place. Okay, that's huge indecision, right? In other words, you trade down, and all of a sudden you gap up and you hold, and then all of a sudden you gap back down and hold. That's saying, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. I was willing to pay up, and now I'm underwater. So the next bigger move is going to be the key move here. And so far, this is holding the volume off the bottom. And I'm talking about this particular bar here, right? That's this one. So far, that little bottom is holding. And there's not much else I can say about it. Everything else still points to a sideways market, but not much else to say. Let's see what the weekly looks like. Now, there's another day of trading coming here. And really can't say much about that either. So let's look at the DAX, see if there's anything on it. The DAX a little bit cleaner. Yeah, so not a lot to say on the daily though. Let's look at the weekly. And the weekly hasn't tested the low. So again, Europe toss up. And of course, I guess that makes sense given the Greek vote coming in on Sunday. So I don't see Europe going anywhere tomorrow. Probably just going to hang around and wait. Let's look at Asia. And in Asia, it's kind of interesting because the Shanghai, the Shanghai's had about a 24% move to the downside in 3 weeks now. So you come off the top, you go straight down 24%. Now what it did do nicely last night, and it looks like we don't have the number in there yet, but I know the volumes was lighter last night. So you trade down into the lows. You had lighter volume. You get under it, you get back over it. This thing's going to try to finally get a decent bounce. Where can a decent bounce take it? Well, in this case, you've broken a lot of swing point lows on the way down. So if we draw these in, you've got it this one. You've got this one right here. That's an overlap. So that's the first area you got to get over it. You get over that one. You got another one here, right? You can see them all lined up. Now, if you got a really good bounce, right, that would take you all the way back to a top one. And that would definitely tell you it's sideways instead of down. Right now, this thing is down. The reversal sign is in, so we should see a bounce. I would expect if you can get over this price point, then you can get back into this area. So this is kind of the key area on the way back up. And that price point's about 4,200. And it's sitting on the close today, it was at 39. So you got to go 300 up. That's 10%. It's crazy numbers. 10% up just to do the real test. And over here, the swing point low is 4,400. So here you got to go 500 up to get the test. That's about 11%. So we'll see how it behaves as it gets up there. But that's probably where it's going to try to bounce to. Now the bounce here, if it's a failed bounce, this thing could set up an even larger range trade to the downside. So even if you get the bounce, right, you could come all the way back into this congestion area here on a failed bounce. So, if you're playing this market, recognize, a 10% move back up is really just a bounce. It's not more than that. Nikkei, last night we were thinking the Nikkei probably get a bounce, did. And that looks like a failure. That looks like it's going to try to come back in some. And let's look at Hong Kong. And that one's inside bar, still nothing happening there. So let me think here. So what does that mean? All of that looks to me like we're not going to do anything. We'll see what Europe does, which is probably nothing. And it looks like Asia is going to be a little weaker. That's what tomorrow looks like. As far as next week, it's going to be news flow off of Greece. Right now that vote looks like it's going to try to help the markets, not hurt them. And so I'm sure that some of that is priced in. The problem with it helping is that it's still going to take another 2 or 3 weeks, and really July 20th now is probably the big date, because that's when you default to the European Central Bank. And if you do that default, things probably get very ugly. So that's that setup. Let's go over to the ox markets. There's only a couple things there I want to show you, and that is the gold and the oil market. Let's start with gold. So gold trades underneath this low. We're on the daily time frame. Trades under the low, right? Doesn't have the volume, right? The volumes here compared to the volumes there is lower. So you test under it. You've already had an extended move down, right? Pretty straight down, fairly large percentage. That looks like it's going to bounce. Okay, so the bounce here will be back into these resistance zones that you see on the charts. And that will be the test. Now, the ugly part of the gold market is that if you move over and you take a look at silver, silver couldn't move hardly at all. Silver already did a test of that low, had more volume, so silver isn't really telling us that this market wants to turn. At least it's not telling us that yet. If you look at the gold stocks, they've looked washed out for some time now. They did an inside day today, even though it was a big bounce. It really doesn't mean much other than the facts that they got a bounce finally. But still, there's not much there. You've got to get gold turning for them to actually get a really good bounce. Now they can get it, but so far they haven't. They have extended. I didn't quite finish that, but they have extended on the downside in terms of an ABCD structure. Same thing in the gold miners, the juniors, right? This breaks multiple swing point lows. Now you get an inside day big bounce. Again, doesn't really mean anything. You get a 2.5%, 3% bounce. It's pretty sad when you get a 3% bounce and it doesn't mean anything, but that is the situation there. If we look at oil, oil breaks down finally. The oil market has been struggling, and so USO, you can see it breaks multiple swing point lows on the way down, and it breaks on the daily time frame. There are no swing point lows on the weekly until you get back down to the lows. The big bar now on the way back is here. That's about 1793. Looks to me like that's where this little puppy's headed. So all in all, I would think you're not going to see much action tomorrow. It's all next week. U.S. indexes next week set up to try to bounce, it looks like. Probably, I'm assuming the Greek situation is such that you get a good vote, or a vote that's a positive, that they do not want to negotiate. If that's true, I suspect the market's going to try to bounce off that news. How far it bounces really is not a clean tell right now, but it does look like it's set up to try and bounce. If for whatever reason the vote goes negative, or you get a collapse in the government, or some other kind of news that puts people on edge, then you could get some of that follow through on the indexes here in the States that would take them down to test those lows first and put in a better bottom. The thing you'd like to see really is a better bottom, but the market doesn't always give you the ideal situation. Many times it just gives you something short of that. All right, that's it for tonight. I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for joining me. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the 4th, and I'll catch up with you Sunday night. Take care. Good night.